She was worth less than a horse, her father said, loud enough for the whole town to hear, and the wind carried those words across the dry main street like dust that refused to settle. Evelyn May Carter stood beside the hitching post, 19 years old, hands folded in front of her, staring at the scuffed toes of her boots, while men twice her age measured her silence as if it were part of the bargain. The animal in question was a tall bay gelding, 16 hands high, strong in the shoulders, the kind of horse a man could build a season around. Thomas Carter ran his palm along the animal's neck with more tenderness than he had shown his daughter in years. "Fair trade," he muttered. No one argued. No one stepped forward. They only watched. At the edge of the crowd stood Silas Whitmore, a rancher whose land stretched nearly 50 miles west of town, a man who had buried his past so deep even the prairie grass had forgotten it. He did not smile. He did not haggle. He simply held the reins steady and looked at the girl as if waiting for something no one else thought to ask. Evelyn did not cry. That was what unsettled them most. She did not beg, did not plead, did not reach for her father's sleeve. Her blue dress was faded from too many summers under a punishing sun, her hair pulled back neat and practical, like a woman already accustomed to surviving what she did not choose. When Silas finally spoke, his voice was low, almost lost beneath the creak of saddle leather. "You understand the arrangement?" he asked, not to the father, but to her. The question hovered in the air, strange and out of place. Thomas answered for her. "She goes with you. That's the arrangement." Silas's jaw tightened, just once. He nodded, then handed over the reins. The exchange took less than a minute. A daughter for a horse. Dust for dignity. But as Evelyn walked beside Silas toward the wagon, something in the way he kept a respectful step between them shifted the story before it had even begun. He did not touch her arm to guide her. He did not rush her pace. When they reached the wagon bed, he set down a folded blanket and said, "It's a 2-hour ride to my place. You can sit where it's steady. No claim. No command. Just space." The town expected a spectacle. They expected shame to follow her like a shadow. Instead, what they saw was a man climbing onto the driver's bench and leaving the passenger seat open, waiting to see if she would take it. And for the first time since the word trade had been spoken, Evelyn lifted her eyes from the ground and studied the man who had just bought her future. Out here, under a sky wide enough to swallow secrets whole, something quiet and dangerous had begun, not ownership, not rescue, but a question no one in that town had ever offered her before. What do you choose? The wagon wheels began to turn, slow at first, then steady, carving twin lines through the pale dirt road that led west out of town, and not once did Silas Whitmore look back to see who was watching. Evelyn sat beside him on the bench after a long moment of hesitation, close enough to hear the quiet rhythm of his breathing, but far enough to feel the space he deliberately left between them, and for nearly half a mile neither of them spoke. The only sound the leather harness creaking and the distant call of meadowlarks rising from fields that had not yet decided whether to turn green or stay brown. The town disappeared behind a bend in the road, swallowed by cottonwoods and dust, and still he did not reach for her, did not offer instruction, did not explain what would be expected when they arrived. After 10 minutes, he cleared his throat softly. "There is water in the canteen under the seat," he said, eyes fixed on the horizon. "It is yours if you are thirsty. Not share. Not permission. Yours." The word landed differently than trade had. Evelyn studied his profile in the afternoon light, the lines around his eyes carved deeper by sun than by anger, the faint streak of gray at his temple, the kind that comes from long winters and longer silences. She had expected something else. A tone of ownership. A reminder of cost. Instead, she found a man who drove as if she were simply a passenger headed somewhere by choice. 2 hours west meant open range, scattered fencing, a sky so wide it pressed down on a person's thoughts until only the truest ones remained. As the wagon climbed a shallow ridge, the land unfolded into rolling prairie broken by a distant barn roof and a thin ribbon of smoke rising straight into the blue. "That is mine," Silas said quietly, nodding toward the far structure. "The house is small. The barn leaks when it rains hard. But it stands." He did not say you will belong there. He did not say you will work. He simply stated a fact, as if offering her the same courtesy he gave the land. Evelyn folded her hands tighter in her lap. She had spent 19 years being told where to stand, when to speak, how much she was worth. Now the absence of orders unsettled her more than any demand could have. When the wagon finally rolled into the yard, chickens scattered and a dog lifted its head, but did not bark. The house sat quiet under the late afternoon sun, paint worn thin, porch boards weathered but solid. Silas climbed down first and stepped back, leaving the space open for her descent. "You can take the front room," he said after a pause. "It has the better window. I will sleep in the loft above the barn until you decide otherwise." Decide. The word lingered in the air between them, fragile and unfamiliar. And for the first time since leaving town, Evelyn felt something shift inside her chest. Not fear, not relief, but the faint, steady pulse of something she had almost forgotten she possessed, the right to choose what happened next. The first night settled over the ranch without ceremony, just a slow dimming of gold into blue as the sun dropped behind the low hills, and the air turned cool enough to carry the scent of dry grass and distant water. Evelyn stood alone in the front room, fingers brushing the edge of the small wooden table beneath the better window Silas had mentioned, half expecting the door to open behind her with new instructions. But the house remained still except for the ticking of cooling metal from the stove. Through the glass, she watched him cross the yard toward the barn with a lantern in hand, his figure steady, unhurried, as if this arrangement had not altered his world at all. He did not look back to see if she watched. He simply climbed the ladder to the loft and disappeared into shadow. The quiet that followed felt heavier than the ride out had been. She waited for a knock that did not come. After several minutes, she stepped onto the porch, the boards firm beneath her boots, and listened. Crickets had begun their evening chorus. A dog shifted in its sleep near the steps. Somewhere inside the barn a horse exhaled softly. No raised voices. No slammed doors. Just space. Inside, she found a basin already filled with clean water and a folded towel set beside it. On the table lay a small envelope with her name written in careful script, not ornamental, just clear. Evelyn. She stared at it as if it might vanish. No one had written her name for years. With hesitant fingers she opened it. Inside was a simple note. "There is flour in the pantry and eggs in the crate by the stove. Eat what you need. We will talk in the morning. Silas." No claim of authority. No reminder of debt. She sank into the wooden chair and let the paper rest against her palm. "Eat what you need." The words unsettled her more than any command could have. For 19 years, she had taken only what was handed to her, and never a crumb more. The pantry door creaked when she opened it, revealing shelves modest but orderly, sacks tied tight, jars labeled in a careful hand. This was not the home of a careless man. It was the home of someone who planned for winter and respected what he stored. She lit a small lamp and moved slowly through the kitchen, not as a servant inspecting duty, but as a guest unsure how long she was meant to stay. Later, when she lay in the narrow bed of the front room, she kept her boots near the door out of habit, prepared to leave at the slightest sign of trouble. The mattress dipped gently under her weight, clean sheets cool against her skin. Through the thin wall she could hear the distant rustle of hay from the barn loft, then silence. He did not test the door. He did not test her resolve. Outside, the prairie stretched endless under a scatter of stars bright enough to make a person feel both small and strangely seen. Evelyn stared at the ceiling and waited for fear to claim her. Instead, what came was confusion, and beneath it, a fragile curiosity about the kind of man who would sleep among horses while the woman he had just brought home slept safely under his roof. Morning arrived without announcement, just a pale ribbon of light sliding through the better window and stretching across the wooden floor until it touched the edge of Evelyn's bed. She had slept in fragments, waking at every shift of wind, listening for footsteps that never came, and when she finally rose the house still carried the clean quiet of a place undisturbed. Outside, she could hear the steady rhythm of an axe striking wood, measured and patient, each swing followed by a pause long enough to suggest thought rather than anger. She dressed quickly and stepped onto the porch, the early air cool against her face, and saw Silas near the woodpile splitting logs with the same calm precision he had driven the wagon. He did not look surprised to see her. He simply lowered the axe and nodded once. "There is coffee on the stove," he said. "I was not sure how you take it. Not a demand to prepare breakfast. Not an expectation that she would serve. Just information offered like a weather report." Evelyn studied him in the morning light, sleeves rolled to his forearms, movement steady, nothing hurried, nothing possessive. The yard stretched wide around them, fenced pasture running nearly 30 acres before meeting the open prairie beyond, and for a moment, she understood how alone a person could be out here if they chose it. She poured herself a cup and sighed, the aroma strong and honest, and found a second mug already set on the table but untouched. He waited until she sat before taking the seat across from her. The wooden table stood between them like a line neither intended to cross without permission. "You can stay here as long as you wish," he said after a long silence. "If you prefer to leave, I will take you wherever you decide." The words did not sound rehearsed. They sounded costly. She searched his face for the catch, for the condition hidden beneath politeness, but found only fatigue and something quieter, something like restraint learned the hard way. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the open doorway where sunlight spilled across the floorboards. "Because no one should be spoken for without being heard," he said at last. The sentence hung between them, simple and firm. No sermon, no self-praise. Outside, a breeze stirred the tall grass, and the sound rolled across the pasture like distant surf. Evelyn felt the weight of the previous day pressing against this morning's stillness, the memory of standing beside a hitching post, traded without question. Here, across a scarred wooden table in a small ranch house 50 miles from town, she was being asked nothing except what she wanted. And that, more than anything, unsettled her, because wanting required courage she had never been allowed to practice. The rest of that morning moved with a careful rhythm, like two strangers learning the steps of a dance neither had chosen, but both intended to respect. After the coffee cups had been cleared, Silas stood and reached for his hat, without ceremony. "There are fence posts leaning along the north line," he said. "I will be working there if you need anything." He paused, then added, "You do not owe me labor." The statement settled between them heavier than the cast iron skillet on the stove. Evelyn watched him step off the porch and cross the yard, long stride steady, shoulders squared not with authority, but with habit. She remained at the table long after the sound of his boots faded into the tall grass. "You do not owe me labor." For 19 years, everything had come with a cost. A meal required gratitude. A bed required obedience. Even silence had been expected as payment. Now she stood in a house where no price had been named. The quiet pressed against her ribs until she could not sit still any longer. She stepped outside, the sun already climbing, warming the earth with a dry, honest heat. The pasture stretched nearly 30 acres, dotted with grazing cattle that lifted their heads briefly before returning to their work. In the distance, she saw him by the north fence, lifting a post, setting it straight, tamping dirt firm around its base with deliberate care. There was no hurry in him, only intention. Evelyn walked halfway across the yard before stopping. She did not know the rules here. Did she remain inside as a guest, or step forward as something else? The wind caught the hem of her dress and carried the scent of cut wood and open land. She moved closer, each step uncertain but chosen. When she reached him, he did not appear startled. He simply wiped his hands on a cloth and nodded. "The soil is softer after last night's dew," he said, as if explaining the land rather than instructing her. She glanced at the crooked post beside him. "I can hold it steady," she offered, the words tasting unfamiliar in her mouth. He studied her for a moment, not measuring strength, but resolve. Then he handed her the post without touching her fingers. The wood was rough against her palms, solid, real. Together they set it upright. No commands, no corrections, just two people adjusting pressure until the line stood straight. When it was done, he stepped back and examined the fence, then gave a single nod of approval that included her in the result. It was a small thing, a post set in dirt on land 50 miles from the nearest town. But as Evelyn brushed soil from her hands, she felt something settle inside her as well, something firmer than fear and quieter than gratitude. Out here, beneath a sky that judged no one, she was not being managed. She was being invited. And that invitation, fragile as it was, began to reshape the space between them. By late afternoon the sun hung low and heavy, casting long shadows across the north line fence they had set together, and Evelyn felt the ache in her palms where splinters had kissed the skin, a small honest soreness that belonged to effort she had chosen. Silas worked a few yards away, driving another post into place with steady strikes, never correcting her grip, never stepping in unless she asked. And the silence between them no longer felt like a wall, but like open land waiting to be crossed. When the last post stood straight, he rested the hammer against his thigh and looked along the fence as if measuring more than wood and wire. "It will hold through winter now," he said quietly. "Not I did this. It will hold." As the light thinned into amber, they walked back toward the house, boots brushing through grass that reached nearly to Evelyn's knees in places, the horizon stretching wide enough to swallow a person's past if they let it. She carried the coil of spare wire over her shoulder. Without being told, surprised at how natural it felt to share the weight. At the porch steps she paused, uncertain whether to enter first or wait. Silas removed his hat and gestured toward the door. "After you." The words were simple, but they unsettled her more than a raised voice ever had. Inside, the house held the faint scent of coffee and sun-warmed wood. He moved to the stove and began preparing supper without announcement, measuring beans into a pot, slicing bread with careful hands that treated the blade as a tool, not a threat. "You can rest," he said, not looking up. "You worked enough for one day." She hesitated, then shook her head. "I would rather help." The admission felt dangerous, as if offering effort might be mistaken for surrender. He studied her for a brief moment, then handed her a tin plate to set the table. No smile, no triumph, just acceptance. They ate facing one another across the same wooden table, dusk gathering at the window, the sky turning a deep violet that pressed close to the glass. After a while he spoke again, voice low. "If you choose to stay, we will put your name on the deed when the papers are drawn." She looked up sharply, certain she had misheard. Land was not given. Land was inherited or taken. He continued before she could form a question. "Half of it. Not because you owe me. Because no one should live where they have no claim." The statement settled into the room like a stone dropped in still water, sending quiet ripples through everything she believed about her worth. Outside, a horse shifted in the barn, and the evening wind moved through the tall grass with a sound like distant applause. Evelyn lowered her gaze to her hands, still faintly marked with dirt from the fence line, and understood that the greatest danger here was not hardship or isolation. It was the slow, steady realization that she was being treated not as something acquired, but as someone invited to build. And that invitation demanded a different kind of courage than survival ever had. The night after he spoke of deeds and shared claim, Evelyn did not sleep easily, not because of fear, but because hope is louder than danger when it first arrives, and she lay awake listening to the wind move across 30 acres of open pasture, wondering what kind of man offers land to someone the world has already discounted. Just before dawn, a distant rumble drifted in from the east, faint at first, then steady, the unmistakable rhythm of hooves striking dry earth. Silas was already awake. She heard the loft ladder creak in the barn, and his boots hit the ground before the riders came into view. 3 horses approached along the narrow road that cut across the prairie toward the ranch, dust trailing behind them like a warning. Evelyn stepped onto the porch, heart steady but alert, and saw her father at the front of the small group, hat pulled low, posture stiff with something that was not regret. He did not dismount immediately. He surveyed the yard, the straightened fence posts, the quiet house, as if calculating value again. Silas walked forward slowly, stopping halfway between the porch and the gate, leaving space on either side as though this were still neutral ground. No raised voice, no hurried gesture, just distance measured in yards and intention. "You have come a long way," Silas said evenly. Thomas Carter's gaze shifted to Evelyn standing on the porch boards, sunlight catching the edge of her hair. "I have come to settle what is mine," he replied. The words fell heavy, familiar, shaped by a lifetime of claiming more than offering. The 2 men stood facing one another across open dirt, the morning air cool and sharp. Evelyn felt the old reflex rise inside her, the instinct to step back, to lower her eyes, to let others decide the shape of her future. But the memory of a fence post set straight with her own hands held her in place. Silas did not move toward her. He did not shield her. He did not speak for her. Instead, he reached behind him and removed the folded bill of sale from his coat pocket, the paper that had marked her like property only days ago. He held it loosely at his side, not as a weapon, not as leverage, but as a reminder of what the world believed. The agreement was honored, he said calmly. Thomas shifted in his saddle. Agreements can change. A breeze crossed the yard, stirring dust between them. Evelyn stepped down from the porch, boots firm against the packed earth, and walked until she stood just behind Silas's left shoulder, close enough to be seen but not hidden. For the first time since that day in town, her father looked uncertain, not because of force, but because no one had spoken yet for the girl he had once traded. The prairie waited, wide and silent, as if the land itself refused to rush what would happen next. Thomas Carter finally swung one leg over his saddle and stepped down into the dust, boots striking the earth with the same certainty he had carried his whole life, as if land and people answered to him by habit. The two men who rode with him remained mounted, silent witnesses, their horses shifting under the growing tension that was not loud but heavy, like a storm gathering without thunder. Silas did not unfold the bill of sale. He did not step closer. He simply waited, hands relaxed at his sides, giving the moment room to reveal itself. Thomas brushed dust from his coat and looked past him toward the house, toward the straight fence line, toward the smoke rising thin and steady from the chimney. "You think a piece of paper settles blood?" he asked, voice low but edged with pride. Evelyn felt the old weight in those words, the belief that blood meant ownership, that family was a chain rather than a bond. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the packed dirt beneath their boots, stretching their shadows long across the yard. Silas spoke without raising his tone. "Paper does not settle anything. Choice does." The word hung in the air, deliberate and calm. Thomas's jaw tightened. "She is my daughter." For a heartbeat, the prairie seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn stepped forward then, not behind Silas, not hidden by his frame, but to his side, equal distance between the two men. Her voice did not tremble when she answered. "I am your daughter," she said quietly, "but I am not your property." The riders shifted in their saddles. The horses flicked their tails against the morning flies. No one reached for anything. No one advanced. The tension was not in hands, but in truth. Thomas studied her, as if seeing her height for the first time, the steadiness in her shoulders, the way she did not lower her gaze. He had expected tears. He had expected pleading. What stood before him was something he had never invested in: resolve. Silas extended his hand then, not toward the girl, but toward Thomas, offering the folded bill of sale. "Take the horse back," he said evenly. "Take the paper. There is no debt between us." The gesture stunned the air into silence. One of the mounted men shifted, clearly uncertain how to measure a man who gave away leverage so easily. Thomas glanced at the outstretched paper, then at the pasture beyond, the cattle grazing in open sun, the fence posts set straight. He understood value when he saw it. But this was value he could not tally in dollars or livestock. Evelyn did not move closer to her father. She did not retreat toward the house. She simply stood, boots firm in the dirt, waiting to be asked rather than claimed. The wind swept across the yard, lifting a thin veil of dust between them, and in that suspended moment the exchange that once reduced her to a bargain began to unravel, not through force, but through the quiet insistence that a human life required permission, not purchase. Thomas Carter did not take the paper right away. He looked at Silas's outstretched hand as if it were a trick, as if generosity must be hiding a hook, and the two mounted men behind him shifted in their saddles, glancing from one face to the other, waiting for a command that did not come. The prairie wind moved steady across the yard, tugging at coat hems and lifting loose strands of Evelyn's hair, and in that open space there was nowhere for pride to hide. "You would hand it back?" Thomas asked at last, suspicion narrowing his eyes. Silas did not lower his arm. "There is no bargain if she does not stand in it willingly," he said. His voice carried no challenge, only fact. Evelyn felt the words settle into her spine, like something solid she could lean against. Her father's gaze turned to her then, searching for hesitation, for fear, for the obedient girl who once waited for instruction before breathing. What he found was a young woman standing straight in the dirt, boots planted, shoulders squared not in defiance, but in certainty. "You are coming home," Thomas said, not loud, but used to being obeyed. The sentence hung unfinished, expecting her to complete it with movement. She did not move. Instead she drew in a slow breath of morning air, carrying the scent of cut wood and sun-warmed grass, and let it steady her. Home is not where I am traded, she answered quietly. The riders exchanged a look. The horses stamped once, restless in the growing heat. Silas finally lowered his hand, folding the paper once more and slipping it back into his coat pocket, not as ownership, but as proof that he did not intend to use it. If she chooses to ride with you, he said evenly, I will not stop her. If she chooses to remain, that is the end of this matter. He stepped aside then, clearing the path between father and daughter, removing himself from the center of the decision. It was a small motion, but it shifted the ground beneath all three of them. Thomas took a step forward, boots pressing into the packed earth. You do not know what life costs out here, he said to Evelyn, his tone softening in a way that felt more like persuasion than care. You do not know what winter will take. Evelyn glanced toward the straight fence line, the barn roof catching sunlight, the wide 30 acres stretching patient and unclaimed by anyone's voice but the wind. I know what it costs to have no say, she replied. The simplicity of it left no room for argument. Silence followed, thick but not hostile, filled with the weight of a choice finally spoken aloud. Thomas's shoulders sagged, just slightly, as if something old and stubborn had loosened its grip. He looked at the land once more, at the man who had refused to assert control, and at the daughter who now stood without trembling. The prairie did not offer applause. It offered space. And in that space, the decision no longer belonged to the loudest voice, but to the one brave enough to claim it. Thomas Carter stood very still after her words settled into the open air, as if the prairie itself had spoken through her, and for the first time since he rode into the yard his certainty seemed to thin beneath the wide sky. The two men behind him shifted again, their horses sidestepping in the dust, unsure whether this visit would end in argument or in silence. Evelyn did not step backward. She did not step forward. She simply remained where she had chosen to stand, the morning sun, warming her shoulders, the scent of hay and clean earth grounding her in a way she had never felt back in town. Silas kept his distance, neither protective nor withdrawn, his presence steady but unclaimed, as if reminding them both that this moment did not belong to him. You think this man offers you freedom, Thomas said finally, his voice lower now, less sharp, shaped more by confusion than command. Evelyn met his eyes without flinching. He offers me the question, she answered. That is more than I have ever been given. The words carried no accusation, only truth. A breeze moved through the yard, bending the tall grass beyond the fence line in slow waves, and the sound filled the pause that followed. Thomas looked toward the pasture, at the fence posts set straight, at the barn that stood weathered but firm, at the house with smoke rising steady from its chimney. He understood labor. He understood value built by hands. What unsettled him was a value that could not be weighed or sold. Silas spoke then, calm and unhurried. She does not belong to me, he said. She belongs to herself. If she leaves, I lose nothing that was not freely given. It was not a challenge. It was a surrender of control. That surrender shifted the ground more than any demand could have. Thomas removed his hat slowly, turning it once in his hands, eyes fixed not on Silas but on his daughter. And if winter comes hard? He asked, the question no longer edged with authority but lined with something closer to concern. Evelyn glanced toward the horizon where the land met sky in a clean, unbroken line. Then I will face it where I chose to stand, she replied. The simplicity of it left no room for bargaining. The riders behind Thomas lowered their gazes, as if recognizing that this was no longer a dispute to witness, but a decision already made. After a long moment, Thomas stepped back toward his horse. He did not reach for her arm. He did not repeat the command. He placed his hat back on his head and gathered the reins in his hand. You are no longer a child, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. It was not an apology, but it was the closest shape his pride could manage. Without another word, he mounted and turned his horse toward the road that led east. The other men followed, hooves striking the earth in a steady rhythm that grew fainter with each passing second. Evelyn watched until the dust settled and the prairie returned to stillness. Beside her, Silas remained silent, offering no praise, no relief, only space. And in that space, beneath a sky wide enough to hold every unspoken truth, she understood that the choice had not only changed her future, it had redefined her worth. The dust from the departing riders settled slowly back onto the earth, as if the prairie itself had decided the matter and now returned to its ordinary breathing. And Evelyn remained standing in the yard long after the last hoofbeat faded into the distance. The silence that followed was not empty but full, layered with the sound of wind through tall grass and the low murmur of cattle grazing beyond the fence line. Silas did not break it. He did not offer comfort or congratulations. He simply looked out toward the eastern road for a moment, then turned back toward the barn as though there were chores that did not wait for anyone's pride. "There is work before noon," he said evenly. "Only if you wish to take part." The choice again. It did not arrive wrapped in ceremony. It arrived like sunlight, steady and unassuming. Evelyn drew a long breath and felt something unfamiliar settle into her chest. Not the tight coil of fear she had carried for years, but a quiet expansion, like space where air had not been allowed before. She followed him toward the pasture without being summoned, her boots pressing into the same earth that had moments earlier held her father's shadow. The fence they had set the day before stood firm against the morning breeze, posts aligned in a straight, unbroken line stretching nearly 200 yards along the north boundary. Silas paused beside one of them, running his hand along the grain as if checking for weakness. "You set this one," he said, not looking at her but at the wood. It was not praise. It was acknowledgement. She stepped closer, placing her palm where his had been, feeling the rough texture beneath her skin. The post did not lean. It held. That afternoon they worked side by side without discussion of what had passed, mending a loose hinge on the barn door, hauling fresh water from the well, moving feed sacks that weighed nearly 50 pounds each. He did not insist on lifting what she carried. He did not treat her strength as novelty. When she grew tired, he noticed but did not comment, simply adjusting his pace to match hers. As the sun drifted westward and painted the fields in warm gold, Evelyn found herself moving through the yard with purpose rather than caution. The house no longer felt like a borrowed shelter. The land no longer felt like a place she might be asked to leave at any moment. It felt, slowly, like ground beneath her own decision. Near dusk, as they stood on the porch watching the sky turn a deep shade of amber and violet, Silas spoke again, his voice quiet but steady. "If you remain, the deed will carry your name before winter." He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at the horizon, as if promising the land itself. Evelyn watched the last light settle across the pasture and understood that the exchange which once defined her had lost its power. No one here measured her in livestock or debt. No one spoke for her without consent. Out on 30 acres of open prairie, beneath a sky that witnessed everything and judged nothing, she had not been rescued. She had been respected. And that difference changed the shape of her future more than any bargain ever could. Autumn arrived without announcement, slipping across the prairie in cooler mornings and longer shadows, and with it came a quiet transformation that neither of them spoke about directly. The deed papers were drawn up in town 2 weeks after her father rode away, and Silas returned one afternoon with a folded envelope tucked carefully inside his coat, dust clinging to his boots from the 40-mile round trip. He did not present it like a gift. He laid it on the kitchen table beside the flour jar and stepped back. "It carries both names," he said simply. The document was plain, ink dark and deliberate. 30 acres listed in careful script, boundaries described by creek bend and fence line. And there, written clearly beside his own, stood Evelyn May Whitmore, a name she had not chosen for marriage but for partnership, a name attached not to possession but to claim. She traced the letters with steady fingers, feeling the weight of paper that could not measure the distance she had traveled in a matter of weeks. Outside, the cattle moved slow through the pasture, their breath visible in the cooling air, and the fence posts she had helped set stood firm against the coming season. Life did not soften because her name was written down. There were still early mornings, still 50-pound feed sacks to lift, still repairs that demanded calloused hands. But something fundamental had shifted. When neighbors rode by now, they tipped their hats not only to Silas but to her, acknowledging what the land already knew. One afternoon, as she balanced the ledger at the small wooden desk near the better window, she noticed a figure approaching along the eastern road, a single rider this time, slower than before. Her father dismounted at the gate without spectacle. He removed his hat before stepping into the yard. No companions, no demands. The prairie wind moved between them, carrying the scent of dry leaves. His eyes drifted to the straight fence line, the barn roof mended where rain once slipped through, the steady smoke rising from the chimney. "I heard your name is on the deed," he said, voice low, almost cautious. She nodded. He studied her face as if searching for resentment, but found only steadiness. "You look different," he added. She considered the words before answering. "I stand different," she replied. The distinction settled gently between them. He did not argue. He did not attempt to reclaim what had already chosen its place. Instead, he reached into his coat and removed a small cloth pouch, setting it on the porch railing. "For the winter," he said. No bargain. It was not repayment. It was not purchase. It was an offering made without condition. Silas remained near the barn door, watching but not intruding, understanding that some reckonings are quieter than others. As the sun lowered behind the pasture and cast long amber light across the 30 acres they now shared, Evelyn realized that the greatest reversal had not been in ownership of land or paper. It had been in the simple truth that dignity, once recognized, does not return to silence. And out here, where the sky stretched wide enough to hold both pride and humility, that truth was worth more than any horse ever could be. Winter came hard that year. Not cruel but honest, laying a clean white sheet across the 30 acres and testing every fence post, every hinge, every promise made beneath an autumn sky. Frost gathered along the barn roof at dawn, and the cattle moved slower through the pasture, their breath rising in steady clouds that drifted into the pale blue morning. Evelyn stood on the porch wrapped in a thick wool coat, watching the sun climb over the eastern ridge, the land quiet and waiting. The deed with her name on it rested inside the house, folded and placed in the wooden drawer near the better window, not displayed, not worshipped, just kept like something earned. Silas stepped out beside her with 2 tin cups of coffee, handing one over without a word. Their shoulders did not touch, but the space between them no longer felt uncertain. It felt chosen. "Fence held through the storm," he said, nodding toward the north line where snow had drifted nearly a foot high in places. She followed his gaze and saw the posts still standing straight, wire taut against the weight of ice. "We set it firm," she answered. He gave a small nod, the kind that carried respect without ornament. Later that morning they worked together to clear a path to the barn, boots crunching against frozen ground, the sound sharp and clean in the cold air. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic reckonings. Only steady effort shared in silence. Around midday, a single rider appeared far off on the eastern road, small against the white stretch of land. Evelyn recognized the posture before she recognized the coat. Her father did not enter the yard this time. He stopped at the fence line, lifting a hand in greeting. She walked out to meet him, snow pressing beneath her boots, the wind brushing her cheeks pink. They spoke quietly for a few minutes, words carried away before reaching the porch. When she returned, there was no shadow behind her. Only calm. Silas did not ask what was said. He did not need to. The past had already loosened its grip. As the sun dipped low and painted the snow in shades of gold and amber, Evelyn paused at the fence they had set months ago and rested her gloved hand against the wood. It felt solid beneath her palm, steady against the wind. Once, she had been weighed against livestock and measured in trade. Now she was measured by the ground she stood on and the choices she made. Silas joined her there, quiet as always, looking out across land that belonged to both of them not because of a bargain, but because of consent. The sky stretched wide above the prairie, endless and patient. Out here, justice had not arrived with raised voices or drawn lines. It had arrived in a question asked softly and answered with courage. And in the hush that followed, beneath a winter sun that promised another season beyond the cold, Evelyn understood that dignity, once claimed, does not need to be defended. It simply stands, like a fence set straight, holding firm against whatever weather comes next.